The whole town laughed when he started digging into the frozen hillside, and now they finally understand why. A retired veteran worn down by life and winter carved a home straight into solid limestone, trusting only his instincts and his loyal German shepherd. Neighbors called it a grave. They said no man could survive Montana winter inside bare rock. But when the coldest night in decades arrived, his strange shelter stayed warm, while every wooden cabin around him froze. What they discovered inside that limestone chamber rewrote everything they thought they knew about survival wisdom and the land itself. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter pressed down on Missoula, Montana, with cutting wind and relentless snow, the Bitterroot Mountains looming like silent judges as temperatures sank far below zero. Walter Hayes arrived at the edge of town the way storms do, without ceremony, without apology. He was a man in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his frame lean from years of disciplined living rather than comfort. His face was carved with sharp angles and deep lines, the kind earned not by age alone but by endurance. A thick gray beard framed his jaw, trimmed short out of habit, and his steel-blue eyes carried a stillness that unsettled people more than anger ever could. He always wore the same heavy red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket faded at the elbows, buttoned even indoors, as if removing it would expose something he preferred to keep guarded. At his side walked Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd, with a broad chest, silver-black coat, alert amber eyes, and the quiet confidence of a dog who had learned long ago that vigilance was love expressed through action. Rex moved with measured grace, never straying far from Walter's left leg, his ears constantly reading the wind, his presence less that of a pet and more that of a sentry. Walter had served decades earlier a career shaped by long deployments and underground bunkers where survival depended not on comfort, but on understanding how the earth itself behaved under pressure. Those years had changed him. He spoke little, trusted slowly, and listened more than he talked, especially when people were quick to dismiss what they did not understand. When he purchased the rocky hillside south of town, a parcel everyone else had ignored for being too steep, too hard, too useless, no one bothered to hide their curiosity. When he began digging straight into the limestone face instead of laying a foundation for a wooden cabin, curiosity turned to open ridicule. Mornings found Walter already at work before the sun burned through the gray sky, his breath fogging the air, as he swung his pickaxe with steady rhythm, not fast, not hesitant, but patient. The sound of steel striking stone echoed across the valley, a hollow, deliberate knock that seemed out of place among the timber frames rising elsewhere. Rex lay a short distance behind him, paws tucked beneath his body, nose lifted toward the wind, occasionally rising to circle the area before settling again. Neighbors gathered at a distance, bundled in heavy coats, their laughter carrying easily across the snow. To them, Walter looked like a man digging his own grave, a broken veteran who had finally lost his grip on reason. James Miller, a broad-shouldered carpenter in his 40s with a thick mustache and the loud confidence of someone accustomed to being right, shook his head openly. He told anyone listening that rock was death in winter, that stone stole heat and gave nothing back, that only a fool would choose bare limestone over stacked logs and a roaring fireplace. Others nodded, reassured by the familiarity of shared belief. Sarah Whitman, a woman in her late 30s who ran the small general store near the highway, watched more quietly. She was tall and slender with pale skin that never quite lost its winter tone, chestnut hair pulled into a practical braid beneath her wool cap, and observant green eyes that noticed details others missed. She didn't laugh as loudly, but she didn't defend Walter either. She had learned through her own hardships that standing apart from the crowd carried a cost she could not always afford. Walter heard them all, The laughter, the comments, the warnings shouted with mock concern. He did not respond. There had been a time years ago when he might have explained himself, laid out logic, and diagrams tried to persuade. That time ended somewhere overseas, beneath layers of soil and concrete, when he learned that truth did not require approval to function. Each swing of his tool followed the natural grain of the limestone, angled slightly upward, just enough to allow cold air to settle away from where a living space would one day be. His hands moved with the certainty of memory. Underground temperature stopped obeying the sky. Underground, the earth remembered warmth. Rex sensed Walter's focus and mirrored it, rising only when strangers came too close, placing his body between them and his handler, without a growl, without drama, simply existing as a boundary that needed no explanation. That quiet confidence unsettled people more than barking ever would. As days passed, the shallow cut in the cliff deepened into a narrow passage, then into something unmistakably intentional. Walter smoothed the walls with care, leaving curved surfaces instead of sharp corners, carving a shallow groove along the floor for water drainage. He left natural stone pillars untouched, understanding instinctively what load-bearing meant, even without formal training. At night, he returned to the small rented room he could barely afford, sitting on the edge of the bed, with Rex's head resting against his knee, the dog's steady breathing grounding him against memories that surfaced uninvited when silence stretched too long. War had taught him many things, but one lesson returned most often: survival favored those who worked with their environment, not against it. He had seen men panic in fortified structures that ignored this truth, and he had seen others endure in spaces that seemed primitive, but were in fact profoundly intelligent. The ridicule intensified as the cold worsened. Snow piled higher. Wind howled down from the mountains. Wooden frames creaked under thermal strain. Walter's excavation, however, remained unchanged by the weather, its interior temperature hovering stubbornly above freezing, even before any fire was lit. People noticed this but dismissed it as coincidence. James Miller laughed louder, predicting that once real winter arrived, the rock would turn against him. Sarah watched Rex one evening as the dog stood at the entrance of the carved passage, snow gathering on his back, while he stared into the dark interior, utterly calm. Something about that image stayed with her longer than she expected. Walter did not rush. He never had. Each hour of work was measured, deliberate, respectful of the stone. He carved an arched ceiling, understanding without formal calculation how weight distributed itself. He planned ventilation channels, small and precise, designed to move air without inviting cold. He worked as though following instructions written into the rock itself. At the edge of town, the laughter continued, but it began to thin, turning from certainty into curiosity. People still mocked, but now they watched longer. Walter felt none of it in his body. His focus remained inward, steady as Rex's watchful gaze. Winter, he believed, would not care who laughed. Winter would only reveal what worked. By the time the first truly brutal night loomed on the horizon, the narrow tunnel had become something more than a hole in a hillside. It was a promise unspoken, carved patiently into white stone. Walter stood at the entrance as dusk fell, resting his gloved hand briefly against the cool rock, feeling not cold but potential. Rex pressed against his leg, solid and warm. Behind them, the town lights flickered uncertainly against the growing dark. Ahead lay silent stone and the kind of truth that only winter could deliver. Walter Hayes had learned long ago that memory did not live only in the mind. It settled into muscle, into breath, into the quiet decisions a man made when no one was watching. As the winter deepened around Missoula, his hands remembered things his voice never spoke. Each strike of the pick against limestone awakened images from decades earlier, when he was younger, leaner, and wearing a different uniform moving through underground bunkers half a world away. Those spaces had been crude, temporary, never meant for comfort, yet Walter remembered the strange calm that lived beneath layers of earth. Explosions could shake the surface, metal could scream orders, could change by the minute. But underground, the temperature stayed steady, almost indifferent to chaos. That contrast had stayed with him long after the war ended. It shaped the way he trusted systems that were quiet, slow, and reliable over those that were loud and fragile. As he worked the limestone face, Walter's posture remained deliberate, his movements economical. He was not a large man, but his shoulders were squared by habit, his spine held straight by discipline drilled into him when hesitation cost lives. His gray beard caught flecks of white dust, and his weathered hands, scarred at the knuckles, moved with careful respect for the stone. Rex watched him closely, head tilted whenever Walter paused, as if reading his mood. The dog's coat had thickened with the season's silver-black fur, dense and glossy, his tail low but steady. Rex was old enough to be calm, but young enough to react instantly, a balance Walter appreciated. He spoke to Rex rarely, but when he did, it was in the same even tone he once used with soldiers under his command. Quiet, precise, reassuring. The tunnel had grown deeper now, long enough that daylight no longer reached its far end. Walter lit a lantern one afternoon and stepped inside, feeling the subtle shift as the air grew still. The sound of the wind vanished, replaced by the muted echo of his own breathing. He stood there longer than necessary, letting the silence settle into him. This was the feeling he remembered. The earth closing in not as a threat, but as shelter. Above ground, people talked about stone as if it were hostile, something that stole warmth and punished mistakes. Walter knew better. Stone did not rush. Stone absorbed. Stone remembered what passed through it. He ran his gloved palm along the wall, feeling not cold, but neutrality, a baseline that winter could not easily corrupt. At the edge of town, conversations shifted as the excavation progressed. James Miller's laughter had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by irritation. He visited the site one afternoon, boots crunching loudly in the snow, his broad frame filling the narrow path. Up close, Miller was imposing with thick arms hardened by years of lifting timber, and a voice that carried authority whether he intended it or not. He frowned at the smooth, arching ceiling Walter had carved and scoffed, insisting that the first real freeze would turn the space into an ice coffin. Walter listened without interruption, eyes calm, hands resting on the handle of his tool. When Miller finally ran out of words, Walter simply nodded once and returned to work. That silence unsettled Miller more than argument ever could. Sarah Whitman came another day alone, carrying a small parcel of supplies she claimed she needed to drop off nearby. She lingered longer than necessary, her sharp eyes tracing the lines of the tunnel, the way the floor dipped slightly before rising again. Sarah had learned to read people through years behind a counter, watching desperation, hope, and stubborn pride pass across faces daily. Walter intrigued her, not because he defied the town, but because he did so without needing acknowledgement. She noticed how Rex positioned himself subtly between her and Walter, not aggressively, just attentively. The dog's loyalty was not loud, it was constant. Sarah said little, only asked how deep Walter planned to go. Deep enough, he replied, his voice low but steady. Something in that answer stayed with her. As the days shortened, Walter's internal world grew louder. The work stirred memories he usually kept buried. Long nights underground, during the war, listening to the earth settle overhead, counting seconds between distant impacts. He remembered men who could not tolerate the closeness, who needed open air to breathe, and others who slept best beneath layers of soil. He had been one of the latter. The ground had never betrayed him. Orders had. Machines had. People had. The earth simply existed, reliable in its indifference. That belief hardened into something close to faith. Rex sensed the shifts in Walter's mood, pressing closer on evenings when memories surfaced. The dog's warmth anchored him, a living reminder that the present still existed. Walter fed Rex first every time a habit formed years earlier, when responsibility meant ensuring others survived before himself. He cooked simple meals, ate little, and returned to the tunnel even after darkness fell, lantern light casting long shadows across the stone. Inside, the temperature barely changed. Walter noted it mentally without ceremony. The theory held. Word spread that the tunnel felt warmer than the open air even at night. Some dismissed it as imagination. Others grew quiet. A retired schoolteacher named Harold Evans, thin and soft-spoken, with wire-rimmed glasses and a stoop from years hunched over desks, stopped by one evening with a thermometer. He was not confrontational, just curious. Walter allowed him inside. The reading surprised them both, steady and above freezing despite the brutal cold outside. Harold nodded slowly, more thoughtful than impressed, and left without comment. The next day, fewer people laughed. Walter knew the true test had not yet arrived. Early winter was deceptive. Real cold came later with no warning and no mercy. He carved ventilation shafts, next narrow and precise, angled to move air without draining heat. He shaped a small firebox directly into the stone, remembering how heat traveled through mass, not space. Fire was not meant to roar here. It was meant to charge the rock like a slow battery. Rex watched every movement, occasionally sniffing the walls, then settling again, trusting Walter's instincts as implicitly as Walter trusted the earth. One night alone in the half-finished chamber, Walter sat on an upturned crate and closed his eyes. The lantern flickered. He listened not for voices, not for wind, but for the subtle sounds of stone adjusting, settling into its new shape. He felt a calm he had not known in years. Above-ground laughter still existed, but it no longer reached him. This place was already doing what it was meant to do, holding steady, waiting. Winter would come fully soon enough, and when it did, it would not care who doubted whom. It would only reveal what endured. Mid-January arrived without ceremony, the way the most dangerous things often do. Missoula woke to a sky the color of iron, the kind that pressed down on the valley and made sound travel farther than it should. By nightfall, the temperature plunged to 25 below zero, a cold so sharp it seemed to slice rather than settle. Wind slid down from the Bitterroot Mountains and threaded itself through every crack it could find. Wood contracted. Nails complained. The town's familiar cabins, stacked logs, chinked seams, proud chimneys began their nightly battle against the dark. Fires roared until throats burned from smoke and eyes stung from exhaustion. Even then, warmth stayed close to the hearth, leaving corners cold and bedrooms colder. Children slept layered in wool and fear breath blooming white in the lamplight, while adults took turns feeding the fire, listening for the quiet panic that followed when flames dropped too low. James Miller had not slept since dusk. His broad shoulders sagged as he bent again toward the stove, thick mustache crusted with frost from opening the door too often. His hands shook not from fear, but from fatigue, the kind that made men careless. He had always believed strength came from doing things the right way, the proven way, and tonight the proven way was barely holding. His youngest son whimpered softly under blankets, and the sound cut deeper than the cold ever could. James added another log, watching the thermometer crawl back toward 45 degrees, knowing it would fall again before morning. Across town, Sarah Whitman sat upright in a chair near her own stove, her tall, slender frame wrapped in layers she would never have worn during the day. Her pale skin looked almost translucent in the low light chestnut hair, loosened from its braid and falling across her shoulders. She listened to the wind and thought against her will of the quiet she had felt standing near Walter Hayes's excavation. She shook the thought away. Stone was stone. Winter would prove it. Outside the town's edge, beneath a hillside, everyone had dismissed. Walter Hayes slept. The limestone chamber held a steady stillness, the air unmoving, heavy in a comforting way. Rex lay stretched on the smooth stone floor, large paws relaxed, chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm that spoke of absolute trust. His silver-black coat caught the lantern glow softly, and his ears flicked only once, responding to distant wind that never reached them. Walter sat at a small table carved from salvaged wood, a chipped mug of coffee steaming gently in his hands. He wore a thin undershirt beneath his flannel, the jacket unbuttoned, forgotten. His gray beard no longer collected frost here. A small thermometer hung from a hook in the wall, its red line unmoving at 66 degrees. The firebox nearby held only dull coals, their heat long since absorbed by the surrounding stone. Walter did not watch the thermometer. He watched the walls. He felt them. The limestone radiated warmth evenly, not hot, not dramatic, just present. Hours passed. The cold outside deepened, cracking tree trunks and freezing river edges solid. Inside the chamber, time moved differently. Walter's thoughts drifted not to fear, but to patterns. He remembered nights in underground shelters during the war, when the world above collapsed into noise while the space below remained constant. That sameness had saved lives. Tonight, it saved comfort. Rex shifted once, rolling onto his side, exposing his belly to the warmth of the stone without hesitation. Walter smiled faintly at the sight, the expression subtle enough it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Just before dawn, footsteps crunched hesitantly through the snow outside the tunnel entrance. Samuel Brooks, a man in his early 50s, with a narrow build and a receding hairline hidden beneath a fur-lined cap, paused to steady himself. Samuel was not a leader in town, nor a loud skeptic. He worked as a delivery driver, knew the roads, knew weather, and respected it. That respect was what had brought him here. He carried a lantern in one hand and a thermometer in the other, his breath coming fast inside his scarf. He had told himself he was only checking, only making sure the old veteran hadn't frozen alone in his hole. The truth was simpler. He needed to see. Samuel called out once, his voice thin and uncertain. No answer came immediately, and his stomach tightened. Then a deeper shadow moved within the tunnel, and Walter appeared. Calm eyes, clear, no gloves on his hands. Samuel stared, words failing him as he stepped inside. The temperature change hit instantly, a physical line crossed in 2 steps. His shoulders loosened without permission. His breath slowed. By the time they reached the main chamber, sweat prickled beneath his coat. He stared at the thermometer on the wall, then at the one in his own shaking hand. 66 degrees. He swallowed hard. It's colder than I've ever felt out there, he said, voice unsteady. Walter nodded once. And steadier than I've ever needed in here, he replied quietly. Samuel noticed everything at once, then the lack of smoke, the quiet coals, the way Rex barely lifted his head to acknowledge a stranger before settling again. This was not luck. This was design. He left before sunrise, saying little, but his face carried something new when he stepped back into the cold. Awe did not feel like triumph. It felt like humility. By mid-morning, the story moved faster than the wind ever could. Harold Evans returned with a notebook, his thin frame wrapped tightly, glasses fogging as soon as he entered the chamber. He measured, remeasured, scribbled numbers with trembling fingers. James Miller came next, bringing his eldest daughter Emma, a small girl with dark braids and hollow cheeks from too many cold nights. Inside the chamber, Emma's shivering stopped within minutes. Her eyes widened as color returned to her face. She touched the wall and smiled. "It's warm," she said simply, as if stating an obvious fact adults had somehow missed. James said nothing. His thick hands pressed flat against the stone, feeling the gentle heat seep into skin that had been numb for hours. The certainty he had carried for decades cracked quietly, painfully, but completely. Sarah arrived later that afternoon. She stood in the entrance longer than anyone else, tall and still, green eyes adjusting to the light. When she stepped inside, she removed her gloves without thinking. Her pale fingers lingered against the limestone, tracing the smooth curve of the wall. She met Walter's gaze, searching his face, not for explanation, but for confirmation that what she felt was real. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Rex approached her calmly, sniffed her coat, then leaned lightly against her leg, before returning to his place near Walter. Sarah exhaled a laugh she hadn't realized she was holding. "You didn't build a shelter," she said softly. "You built an answer." Walter shrugged. Winter asked the question, he replied. By nightfall, the cold began to ease, but something else had shifted more permanently. Laughter disappeared, replaced by silence and calculation. People counted their firewood. They remembered the way warmth had wrapped around them inside the stone. Walter watched none of it with satisfaction. He had not built this to be believed. He had built it to endure. Rex slept soundly at his feet, as the valley learned a truth it had resisted all season. Stone did not steal warmth. Stone remembered it. And Winter, the final judge, had spoken. By the end of that week, Missoula no longer spoke about Walter Hayes in the tone of a joke. The shift did not happen all at once, nor did it announce itself loudly. It arrived the way real understanding often does, quietly, through numbers written twice to be sure, through thermometers checked and rechecked, through hands pressed against stone in disbelief. Men and women who had once laughed now approached the hillside without bravado, carrying notebooks, rulers, and the careful expressions of people unlearning something they had believed for most of their lives. Walter watched them come and go without commentary. He did not guide tours or offer lectures. He worked when work needed doing, and rested when Rex's steady presence reminded him that survival was not a performance. The chamber had become a place of calm observation, not triumph. The limestone walls radiated the same gentle warmth, regardless of who stood within them, as indifferent to pride as they were to doubt. James Miller returned first this time, without sarcasm and without his booming voice. He brought Emma again, bundled but no longer shivering, her small hands gripping his thick fingers with trust earned through fear. James looked older than he had a week earlier, the deep lines around his eyes etched by sleepless nights and an unspoken guilt that came from realizing how close he had come to failing his family. His broad frame seemed heavier, not with weight, but with humility. He spoke little, asking only how long the chamber held its heat after the fire died. Walter answered simply. "Long enough," he said. James nodded, his mustache twitching as he swallowed hard. He knelt beside his daughter when she asked the same question as before, her voice now curious rather than weak. "Is it summer?" Walter lowered himself carefully, meeting her at eye level, his sharp features softening in a way few had seen. "No," he said, steady and kind. "Winter just can't get in here." The sentence traveled through the room and into the silence that followed, settling deeper than any technical explanation ever could. Sarah Whitman came more often now, sometimes alone, sometimes escorting others who needed reassurance. Her tall, slender frame moved with quiet confidence through the chamber, Her green eyes taking in details most people overlooked: the curve of the ceiling, the placement of the ventilation channels, the way condensation never formed along the walls. Her chestnut hair, usually braided tight for work, now fell loosely over her shoulders. When she stayed longer, her pale skin warmed by the stone's steady radiance. Sarah was not easily impressed. She had grown up watching people oversell ideas that collapsed under pressure. What convinced her here was not spectacle but consistency. Every visit felt the same: warm, still, honest. She began to ask questions not out of doubt but out of genuine interest. Walter answered when it mattered, and stayed silent when words would only complicate things. Between them grew a quiet understanding shaped by mutual respect rather than familiarity. Rex accepted her fully, now greeting her with a slow wag, and settling near her feet when she sat, a gesture that spoke volumes to those who knew the dog. Others followed. Harold Evans returned with more precise instruments, his thin hands steadier now as he recorded temperatures at different hours of the day. He spoke softly, almost reverently, about thermal stability and mass, careful not to sound as though he were teaching. Samuel Brooks came again, bringing 2 neighbors with him, his narrow face carrying a seriousness that made them listen when he spoke. New faces appeared too. One was Margaret Collins, a woman in her late 50s with sharp cheekbones and silver hair cut short for practicality, her posture rigid from years spent caring for others before herself. She had lost her husband to a winter illness years earlier, and the memory had carved caution into every decision she made. She stood quietly in the chamber, eyes closed, breathing deeply, as if measuring something beyond temperature. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was firm. "If this had existed, then," she said softly, not accusing anyone in particular, "things might have been different." No one replied. There was nothing to say that would not cheapen the truth of it. The language around Walter's shelter changed next. Words like cave and hole disappeared, replaced by home and chamber. Children spoke of it with wonder rather than fear. Adults spoke of it with lowered voices, as if acknowledging something sacred. The phrase that stuck, no one knew who said it first, was that the house remembered warmth. The idea spread quickly, not because it sounded clever, but because it felt right. Wood burned and forgot. Stone absorbed and remembered. That distinction became impossible to ignore once felt firsthand. People began counting their firewood piles with new eyes, calculating losses they had long accepted as unavoidable. The laughter that once followed Walter's work had vanished, replaced by a heavy, thoughtful silence that lingered in conversations throughout town. Walter himself did not change. He rose at the same hour, worked with the same deliberate rhythm, spoke with the same restraint. If anything, he seemed more inward, now aware that attention carried expectations he had no desire to fulfill. He had not built this to be admired. He had built it because he trusted what he knew. Rex mirrored that steadiness, remaining calm amid the increased traffic, never anxious, never possessive, simply present. The dog's age showed in the silvering around his muzzle, but his eyes remained sharp, his loyalty unwavering. He slept deeply now, untroubled by the wind outside, as if the stone itself had given him permission to rest. One afternoon, a man new to town arrived with rolled papers under his arm and questions ready on his tongue. Thomas Reed was in his early 40s, tall and angular, with a neatly trimmed beard and the restless energy of someone who had built his identity around understanding systems. He introduced himself as a civil engineer who had left a larger city after a bridge failure he had not caused but had been blamed for. That failure had changed him, making him precise to the point of obsession, distrustful of assumptions that lacked proof. Thomas asked to see everything. Walter allowed it without enthusiasm or resistance. The engineer measured, calculated, frowned, recalculated, and finally grew quiet. He did not smile. He did not praise. He simply said, "This shouldn't work the way people think it does." Walter met his gaze. "That's because people think wrong," he replied. Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of professional humility settling onto his sharp features. As days passed, plans began to form, not announced, not agreed upon, but sensed. People started looking at hillsides differently, at rock faces, not as obstacles, but as possibilities. The town's rhythm shifted subtly. Fires burned a little lower. Conversations grew longer, more thoughtful. Winter had not softened, but people had. They had been forced to confront a truth that did not care about tradition or pride. Walter's shelter had not argued with them. It had simply existed warm and steady until denial exhausted itself. Walter stood at the entrance one evening, the sky darkening above the valley, Rex, beside him Sarah, a few steps back, speaking quietly with Margaret Collins. The air outside was bitter, unforgiving. Inside, warmth waited without fanfare. Walter felt no victory, only a quiet certainty that something irreversible had begun. The laughter was gone. In its place stood silence, and within that silence the first stirrings of change rooted not in novelty, but in recognition. Spring arrived in Missoula without apology, melting the snow, the way truth melts resistance slowly, at first, then all at once. The Bitterroot Mountains released their grip on the valley, and the frozen ground softened into dark, breathing earth. Where laughter had once echoed against bare hillsides, there was now the steady rhythm of measured work. The rocky slopes that had been dismissed as worthless through generations were no longer ignored. People approached them differently now, with respect rather than frustration, with patience instead of force. Permission was asked before the first strike of a tool. Walter Hayes watched this transformation. From the entrance of his limestone home, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if he had always known this was how it would unfold. Men and women came to him not as spectators but as students. They did not bring money. He would not have accepted it even if they tried. What they brought instead were questions asked with humility. Walter answered them the same way he had always answered the earth, slowly, deliberately, and only when the question was worth the effort. He taught them to read stone the way others read weather, to notice the grain, the seams, the places where resistance meant danger, and the places where cooperation meant strength. He showed them how to dig patiently, how to let the rock guide the hand rather than fight it, how to shape space that would endure without demanding constant attention. "Stone speaks," he told them once, his voice, even his gray eyes, steady. Most people just don't wait long enough to hear it. Sarah Whitman became one of his closest observers, though she would never have called herself an apprentice. She was still tall and slender, still pale-skinned with chestnut hair, now often tied back loosely, her green eyes sharper than ever. But there was a new softness to her movements, a confidence born not from certainty, but from understanding. She watched Walter work, listened when he spoke, and asked questions that went beyond technique. She wanted to know why people had forgotten what stone could do, why tradition had narrowed instead of expanded. Walter did not offer theories. He offered history fragments of lived experience, stories of places where people survived by aligning themselves with the land instead of dominating it. Sarah carried those stories back to town, not as arguments, but as quiet truths that settled into conversations naturally. James Miller built the first new stone shelter after Walter's, though he never pretended it was his idea. His broad shoulders still carried the weight of responsibility, but his voice had softened. The loud certainty that once defined him had been replaced by something steadier. He worked alongside Walter when invited, learning to slow his hands to listen before acting. His daughter Emma grew stronger that spring, her laughter lighter, her cough gone. James never forgot that winter, and it changed him in ways no lecture ever could. He became careful with his words, especially when others mocked ideas they did not yet understand. Others followed. Margaret Collins oversaw the carving of a modest chamber near her small home. Her silver hair tied back her sharp cheekbones, set in quiet determination. She worked not for innovation, but for peace of mind. Thomas Reed, the engineer, documented what he saw with precision, sketching diagrams late into the night, his angular face softened by the relief of discovering something solid after years of professional doubt. He spoke less about theories now, and more about responsibility, about how progress should be measured, not by novelty, but by resilience. Through it all, Walter remained unchanged. He did not lead a movement. He did not name a method. He lived. He worked. He listened. His limestone home required little from him. A small fire now and then. A few pieces of wood where others burned cords. The stone held what it had been given, releasing warmth evenly, patiently, without complaint. Rex aged gracefully at Walter's side, his muzzle silvering, his movements slower, but no less purposeful. He still lay guard at the entrance each winter night, broad body blocking drafts, amber eyes half closed, but aware. When the cold returned, as it always did, Rex slept deeply, trusting the walls that had never failed them. Walter lived out his remaining years in that chamber, not isolated, but centered. Visitors came less frequently as stone shelters became familiar sights along the valley's edges. The novelty faded, replaced by quiet acceptance. Walter preferred it that way. He spoke little of legacy, but those who learned from him understood what he had given them. It was not a design or a blueprint. It was permission to question assumptions, to listen to what had always been there, to trust knowledge older than pride. When Walter finally passed, it was without spectacle in his sleep. The stone walls holding the warmth of his last fire long into the night. Rex lay beside him until morning, unmoving, faithful to the end. The chamber remained exactly as it had been, solid and patient. No plaque marked the entrance. No monument rose above it. There was no need. The legacy Walter left behind lived in the hillsides now dotted with quiet, warm shelters, in families who slept through winter nights, without fear, in a town that had learned slowly, humbly, that progress did not always mean building higher or louder. Sometimes it meant listening backward toward wisdom, written in stone long before anyone thought to argue with it. In the coldest winters that followed, it was the once mocked who slept most peacefully. And the earth, unchanged and unbothered, continued to teach the same lesson to anyone patient enough to listen. In the end, this story was never really about stone or winter, or even survival. It was about a quiet miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder, but with patience. Some would call it physics, others would call it wisdom, passed down through generations. But there are moments when those lines blur and what remains feels like grace. The earth holding warmth through the coldest nights is not an accident. It is a reminder that God placed answers into creation long before we learned to argue with it. When Walter trusted the ground beneath his feet, he wasn't defying nature. He was listening to what God had already written into it. In our daily lives, we often chase louder solutions, faster, fixes, bigger structures, believing that strength comes from force. Yet again and again we're shown that real protection, real peace, comes from humility, patience, and faith. Sometimes the miracle isn't that the storm stops. Sometimes the miracle is that God prepares a shelter we almost ignore, wisdom, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to slow down and trust. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on what you might be overlooking in your own life. Share this message with someone who needs warmth, not just from the cold, but from doubt, fear, or exhaustion. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what quiet lessons life has taught you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that remind us of faith, resilience, and hope. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide you through every winter you face, seen and unseen. And may His quiet miracles meet you exactly where you are.